Hello, I just want to share a short Dvar Torah for Parshas Vayikra. I mentioned this in the weekly Parsha class. The Stipler says there are two types of mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs that we are required to do, like eating matzah and blowing a shofar, and there are mitzvahs that are not requirements. We can do them if we want to do them. For example, a nazir. A nazir is somebody who decides to take a vow upon himself to not drink wine, not come in contact with the dead, and not cut his hair. He's not required to do it, but he does it to come closer to Hashem. It's not a requirement, it's an option. So the Stipler asks, what's the point of these mitzvahs, these commandments which are voluntary? We don't have to do them, but if we want to, we can. For instance, we find them in this week's parsha, and in Sidra Vayikra in general. We have korbanos, we have sacrifices that the Jewish people are required to bring, and then there are sacrifices a person can bring if he wants. So what's the point? So he answers this question with another question of, there's a commandment in the Torah to love God. So he asks, how can we be commanded to love Hashem? Right? How can God command us to have a feeling? You can't command someone to feel a certain way. He either feels that way or he doesn't feel that way. So he cites the Rambam, who writes that one way that a person can come to a feeling of loving God is by contemplating nature and the wondrous aspects of God's creation, how complicated nature is and how everything works together and fits together. And when someone contemplates how God made the world, that will generate a love for God right away. And he says, however, there's another way. When we do something that we're not required to do, it shows love. When we fulfill a commandment that God doesn't require us to do, but we have the option to do it if we'd like, in that case, we are destroying, in a way, a part of ourselves. We would not necessarily want to do this thing at this moment. We have an extra animal. We would rather eat it or keep it to ourselves and use it to make some clothes. But we decide instead, you know what? I'm going to forego what I want to do. I'm going to give this animal to Hashem. I'm going to sacrifice this animal into Hashem. When somebody does that, then he creates a love of God. When someone gives from himself, when he's not required to do it, that action generates a love. So when we fulfill those commandments, which are not required but are optional, doing those commandments will will create a love for Hashem. And he says something very interesting at the end, and I would like to read this inside the book. He says, in this aspect, converts, people who converted to Judaism, and people who are Baal Teshuva, people who weren't brought up religious but became religious later in life, they're better than other Jews in this respect. They chose, they made a decision, converts and Baal Teshuva chose to make a decision to serve Hashem. Someone who was brought up religious, that's all he knew, that's all he was brought up with. He only knew how to serve Hashem. But someone who made the choice to join the Jewish people or to keep the Torah, he is serving Hashem in a way he feels almost voluntary, that he's giving of himself when he feels, even though he is required, when someone converts, they are required to serve Hashem, or Baal Teshuva is required, but he himself feels that he's doing something voluntary, and that creates a tremendous love for Hashem. And he says perhaps that's the reason why we say that converts, we say that converts are more careful in the way that they keep the commandments and the way that they keep the mitzvahs more than other Jews, because they came to the Jewish people with a tremendous love and doing something that they weren't required to do. They weren't required to be Jews and to take on all of these 613 commandments. Nevertheless, these converts and these Baal Teshuva, who from their own will decided to come and serve Hashem, that is like fulfilling the commandments that one is not required to do. One has that feeling of fulfilling the commandments that one is not required to perform. And when someone does that, he creates a tremendous love within himself for God. So something that we can all do at this point is to, in addition to fulfilling the mitzvos and the commandments that we are required to do, we could try to improve ourselves a little more by learning a little more Torah, or praying with a little more intent, or giving maybe more charity than we're required. There's a lot of people now that are struggling, that have lost their jobs, and giving charity, something that we're not required to do, giving beyond, going above and beyond, that will generate a tremendous love for Hashem, and that's a great thing to do now in addition to help our fellow Jews. And if anyone wants information of how to help people that are in need during this time, but the idea is that there are two types of commandments. There's the commandments that we're required to do, and those commandments which are voluntary. We can do them when we want, but when we do those commandments that are not absolute requirements, we generate a love, and we develop a love for God, which is a tremendous mitzvah. And may we all be blessed to develop an Avas Hashem in our hearts and to love God and to fulfill our mission as best we can and have a beautiful and healthy Shabbos.